Please go ahead, Walter.
Well, good morning. I had an unusual career for anybody in journalism because working for the Washington Post, I was allowed to sort of cover national security the way I wanted to, or what I thought was new and different. But part of the background for me that was different is prior to joining the Post, I had written magazine articles. And in the early 1960s, an article I wrote about foreign agents in the United States, Americans hired by foreign governments, was in a magazine called The Reporter. And Senator Fulbright, who is then chairman Foreign Relations Committee, had a staff call up, and the end result was I took a sabbatical from journalism, and for 18 months I ran an investigation of foreign agents for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that resulted in changes to the Foreign Agent Registration Act in 1963, quite a while ago. Fulbright then offered me an opportunity to come back in 5 years and run another 18-month investigation of the military and foreign policy. By then I was working for the Post, and Ben Bradley gave me a leave of absence. And in that second investigation, I had already begun writing about nuclear weapons, and I learned a lot more. But both the sabbaticals working for government taught me how little reporters knew about what was going on, and it affected the way I did reporting from then on. One, because I was much more alert to listening and reading what was in print. And two, obviously, I'd gotten access to people I never would have known before if I hadn't worked for government. So I'm a great believer in journalists taking a sabbatical and working at any level of government to see how it really works, because over the years, and I've taught about it, we now have government by PR, in which much of what is said in public is aimed at being printed, and it may or may not be the truth. And in fact, more and more, we're seeing out of public, particularly political figures, things that are incorrect or just outright lies. So I'm start off being very cynical about public statements by public people. Anthony, why don't you take over?
Yeah, well, just firstly, it's an honor to be with you on this panel. So such a distinguished journalist with such an amazing career. So just thanks again for that. While it doesn't appear much next to Walter's career, I've been in journalism about more than 25 years, doing mostly foreign policy based out of Europe. I guess the closest kind of experience I've had with that was ahead of the Iraq War. I was based in The Hague. And for those of you who don't remember, don't know, that the US was very actively pursuing its, building a coalition to attack Iraq with false allegations that Iraq had chemical weapons. And I was actually kind of alone out reporting in The Hague at a fairly unknown organization, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And this organization was trying to bring Iraq on board to the organization, which would have opened Iraq up to inspections and could have averted the war. So I was reporting on this, but I have to say the US government and my employer at the time were not interested. If Iraq had joined the organization, they would have opened up to inspections and they wouldn't have found anything, is my my suspicion. And well, they never did. But yeah, the fog of war or the momentum that builds within a government, and in fact, also the mainstream media ahead of war and during a conflict, is something that's very hard to push back against. And I was a young reporter in my 20s, trying to report on it was a smear campaign by the US government to undermine this organization's efforts to bring Iraq, or Saddam Hussein, to bring him on board the organization. So I covered 4 conflicts when I was at the Associated Press, and I spent 8 years in Asia and covered conflicts in Sri Lanka and East Timor, and I spent time covering the Iraq War. And most recently now for Reuters, I've been, I spent many years covering war crimes and the efforts to bring to justice those responsible for the war crimes, the Milosevic trial in The Hague. And most recently spent a bit over a month in Ukraine, down in Kherson, 3 weeks. And we were investigating the use of sexual violence and torture by the occupying forces in Ukraine. But yeah, I mean, the most effective reporting I did on kind of the non-proliferation on chemical weapons was through building sources, diplomatic sources that took years. And those were in place before the war broke out in Syria. So when chemical weapons were being used in Syria, I had a whole a large number of diplomatic sources who I could go to and to report on what was going on, and not to lap up the propaganda and the rhetoric of the war. And that's what I still try to do today. And I think it's a combination of being cynical towards what governments tell you and knowing how to handle information when not to run a lot of disinformation. I've run into very often. So yeah, let's open up with that. If there's any questions, everybody, please do pipe in at any time.
Thank you so much for the introductory remarks. I think it is indeed a great opportunity that we have to ask exactly the questions that you guys are interested in from the people who have been working on this and reporting on these issues for quite some time. So please, the floor is open for your questions.
Can I put a question, please? I'm Peter Rickwood of Thomas Reporters. Walter, this is addressed to you. A reporter who comes to the nuclear file without any knowledge, what's the first thing they should do, she or he, please?
To me, and how I made my livelihood, is to read everything. One of the earliest things I did was to write the first stories about the so-called neutron bomb, which was a low-yield artillery shell, which we were about to build to replace one we had in Europe. And I found out about it by reading the text, the declassified text of House Armed Services Committee budget hearings, in which in one section they referred to the administration authorizing production of enhanced radiation warheads, which I had known, thanks to working with Fulbright, were low-yield neutron artillery shells. And I took that one sentence and began interviewing people at the Pentagon and at Los Alamos, which is another thing. I began going out to, Ben Bradley allowed me to go out to Los Alamos and to Livermore and interview people. And I found that the scientists were much more open talking about what they were doing than were the bureaucrats in the Pentagon. But I wrote the first stories about the neutron, and eventually the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter, deferred production of it. Reagan introduced them, and then in 1991, George H.W. Bush removed tactical weapons from Europe. But the other thing about doing is stay with the subject and get to know the people involved. Anthony was talking about the Iraq War. I had met Hans Blix, who was the UN inspector back in the 1950s, 60s. And so when he became chief inspector, he alerted me to the fact that they had all the allegations from US intelligence and other Western intelligence about Iraq's possible possession of nuclear weapons, or at least trying to build them. And Blix told me he had begun his investigations and nothing was turning up, which led me to start questioning people at the Pentagon that I knew and the State Department. And I guess I wrote along with the night newspaper people, first stories raising doubt about Saddam either possessing or trying to rebuild his attempts to build nuclear weapons. So it's a combination of reading things and knowing people. And you get that experience by trying to become expert in a subject, and staying and being allowed, I should say, to stay with it. And that's what happened to me in the Post. They let me do it.
Yeah, Walter, Peter again, you used the word allowed to do it. And I wonder today, and this is also for Anthony as well, how do editors react to a reporter proposing a story on nuclear related issues? Because, okay.
Well, to be honest, if you have a unique breaking story, we're in the land of scoops, or alleged scoops. So if you have something totally unique and dramatic, you get to get your stuff printed. I'll be honest and say, when nuclear weapons, which is one of the things I specialize in, when it is not a headline story, I had a hard time getting them printed. But again, it's finding the stories that are unique, because most of, today's paper, tomorrow's paper will be loaded with Trump stories. And so it's very difficult to get people, get editors, publish anything else. In fact, since Trump became a figure, he draws hits, and you're now living in a web journalism-centric business, and hits are more important than the substance of the story, I hate to say. depending on who you're working for. Since I left the Post, I write for a national security website once a week. Same column I wrote for the Post twice a week. And I pick my subjects, and I'm doing a piece for next Tuesday, which is when my column runs, on the building of a new warhead for the new ICBM. And the beginning source is an article in the December copy of Lawrence Livermore Laboratories monthly magazine, or bi-monthly magazine, which has the best description of how you build a brand new weapon I've ever read. And my website, Decipher Brief, I know will make it one of the main stories in Tuesday's issue. But I have my doubts if the Post would have done the same.
Walter,
If I could add a little bit on that. So, you know, more than ever, the news cycle comes and goes at an amazing speed, and attention spans are short, and clicks matter for a lot of media outlets. I think what's important as journalists is that, well, first of all, if you become the expert in your field, and Walter was saying that means reading everything you can get your hands on, follow the people, and ideally meet the people who are making the decisions, who have the information, and stay in touch with them as sources. There will be periods where there's going to be a lot of news on a certain subject, whether it's nuclear weapons or whether it's chemical weapons, in my case. But because I had spent years cultivating sources, when the news fades, I used that opportunity when the pressure was off to go and meet a lot of people. There wasn't any news from that meeting, but a year later or 2 years later, I could meet that same source and they were working somewhere else, or they had new information, and then it would come back. And I was then, you know, ideally you're then well positioned to write that story when that story comes back. So stay in touch with those sources, stay in touch with people, meet people. You know, when the story seems like it's faded, keep them in your Rolodex, keep those names in your Rolodex, stay in touch with people, because you never know where they're going to be next. And these stories do come back, as you've seen with the nuclear story now. Of course, we've seen kind of peaks in the nuclear story, right, with Iran, and now, of course, with the confrontation with Russia and Ukraine.
The one thing I'd add to what Anthony said is don't interview somebody until you have read deeply into what you're going to ask them about. The worst thing you can do is walk up to someone and say, what's going on or what's happening. Much better to say, I read, this is what's happening. Is that true?
Yes. Thank you for that. Let's hear from our participants. And if you could briefly say your name and your affiliation. Yes, please.
Jeff Lauder. Can
Can
you hear me? Speak louder.
speak louder.
All right, I'll shout, hope for the best. I'm a Noman merchant with the Associated Press, and you know, rereading with the recently passed 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, reading Walter's stories in particular in the Post that were some of the first to call into question the U.S. intelligence conclusions about mobile labs and all of that. What was it like facing pressure within your own newsroom when the U.S. government was putting out material that turned out to not be substantiated, and you know, and a lot of elite media, there was a lot of pressure to run certain U.S. government conclusions. What was it like to resist that pressure?
My best example is during Iran, I covered the Iran Contra scandal, which was during the Reagan administration. And the question came up, was the US selling arms through the Israelis to Iran in order to get terrorists to release American hostages held by the terrorists. And it was the same time that Bob Woodward was dealing with the head of the then head of CIA named Bill Casey. He eventually wrote a book about it. And to be frank, Woodward and I used to have to argue in front of the national desk about whether my saying they were selling arms and his saying Casey said they weren't. And we the Post, being the Post at that time, figured out a way to sort of make both of us happy by putting what Woodward found as an insert into my stories. In the end, it turned out, happily for me, I was right. And Bob and I eventually collaborated on a couple stories.
When I was covering the run-up to the Iraq War, there were US government sources trying to feed me their line. And I was resisting it because the other sources I was talking to said it's just not true. They were trying to forcibly remove the head of the chemical weapons organization because he was trying to bring Iraq on board, and they didn't want Iraq to be brought on board. So when they fed me or called me and said, we've got somebody who wants to talk to you on background and we think it's, you know, big news. And so they organized a call and I didn't run it. What they did was they would wait till I went to bed in European time and they would call somebody else from the AP in Washington who didn't know the Chemical Weapons Organization, didn't know that Colin Powell had just written a letter months before praising the work of the OPCW, and now they were saying that the man was mismanaging the place. Jose Bustani was his name. So the organization was so big that even though I resisted it at one end, it got picked up at the other end, which made it very difficult. But yeah, when that type of pressure comes, the editors were caught up in the pressure and that was building the momentum behind war. And of course, the government was pushing its, the American government was pushing its line. So extremely difficult. And I was in my late 20s, so I didn't have a lot of experience. It was very difficult to push back.
Please.
Hi, this is John Becklin, the editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. And this is for Anthony. Chemical weapons in Syria, blizzard of competing claims, disinformation, whatever. I just wanted to hear you speak about how you deal with it, because it will come.
Yes. So I, while covering this, the Syrian war, Russia became a military backer of Syria. And the Chemical Weapons Organization itself and a body they set up, an investigative team set up with the UN, was investigating claims of use of chemical weapons. At a certain point when, and initially in the war, the US and Russia were cooperating and trying to rid Syria of its chemical weapons stockpile. But once Russia became actively involved in the war, and I mean militarily, they were active, right? They had planes and they had very active support of Syria. They stopped that cooperation and they started spinning the narrative on the chemical weapons in Syria. And at this point, I had been covering it for many years. And I knew as a fact that the chemicals that were provided for Syria's chemical weapons program had come from the Soviet Union, and that a lot of the stories they were trying to spin, the narrative they were trying to spin, was lies. And in particular, it was the instance of a chemical attack in a town called Duma, which killed dozens of people, and Russia hijacked the narrative to say that the whole attack was staged. Now, I had kind of very close information because of the sources I had built, knowing that this was not the case. But a lot of very well-known journalists, including some very famous, influential prize-winning ones, such as Seymour Hersh, Roger Waters, by the way, names like that, big names, started piling in and defending that line, saying that that the chemical weapons organization that there was a staged attack. So what did I do? As media outlets all over the world started running this story, big, in some cases well-respected media outlets, and my editors would ask me, "Hey, Deutsch, why aren't you covering this?" And I would say, "Well, because I know that it's false." So what I did is I did one story in which I set out the Russian allegations saying that the Duma attack was fake. And then every time they came again and started spreading the same false narrative, I didn't report on it. And I have to say that that was also extremely difficult, because when you have your foreign editor calling you saying, "Hey, we've seen this, that, and there in this publication or that publication, why aren't you doing it?" I would have to explain every time. Because just by repeating it, I think it gave it credibility. So that was a decision that I had to make. And that was based on the knowledge that I had built up on the subject matter.
Okay, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, Jack Detch from Foreign Policy Magazine. You talked a little bit sort of about sourcing. I'm just curious, how you approach it. Is it by individual, by agency? And just given the comments that you just made, Anthony, I think, Walter, you've made similar comments. How do you approach, like, especially with sources you've had longer term relationships, trying to feed you lines that, are inaccurate or you see as incorrect? Do you try to maintain those relationships, or do you cut them off?
I can start on that one. I tried to maintain all contacts, and you can imagine at the Chemical Weapons Organization, it's like the UN, and every country has a diplomat representative at this organization. And in the beginning of the war, I actually would meet with both the Syrian and the Russian delegates at the OPCW. They stopped as background meetings, but they stopped agreeing to those. I tried to actually maintain those communication lines because and it's my job as reporting for a newswire, which prides itself in being balanced and getting both sides of that story. And if I had access to the Russians or the Syrians through all that, I would have been very glad to have continued meeting with them. If I know, so there's a couple of ways to protect against being fed a false narrative. One, and Walter has mentioned this, I'll say it again, become the expert in your field. That's one way, because they can't spin you bullshit if you know what they're talking about, right? So that's one way. The other way is by using multiple sources. And in all these conflicts, you're going to have various parties who see things a different way, different sides of the conflict. We've seen the Syrian war split the OPCW along political lines. And the way to protect yourself is and getting the closest to the truth in a story is by meeting as many sources as possible. So if I was getting a narrative from one specific source, I would go meet multiple other sources and I would verify and check that information. And my kind of standard and you know, in this sensitive matter, and Walter will know this, a lot of people aren't going to be able to talk to you on the record. So you're having background meetings or even off the record meetings with people, or they want to talk to you anonymously. You have to check and counter check that. So I had a minimum of 2. And if they independently from each other told me the exact same thing, that would make me a little more comfortable. But I would really feel comfortable if they were very sensitive accusations of having a minimum of 3 anonymous sources that I knew and respected. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'll go back to this idea of reading everything and trying to become expert. There are all sorts of tricks. I mean, luckily, I've always been in Washington. And for example, even today, when the Senate Armed Services Committee has a hearing with witnesses from the government, they generally have a prepared statement, and then they have to give a 5-minute version of it. 90% of the time, people covering that hearing, and they cover hearings less and less, none of them would read the prepared statement, which would be 10, 15, sometimes 20 pages, and would just go by what went on in front of them. And generally, particularly on appropriation hearings or authorization hearings by the services, the prepared statements got much more material, factual material. And then I began discovering things that nobody would think of. And that's when you bring up the Iraq War. By then I was in my 70s, I had said. So I stopped going to war. But believe it or not, every day the government, through an agency, publishes every contract signed by the US government. And you can search it. It's a searchable website. And I literally covered the Iraq War by finding contracts. Best example was that we were contract to build a camp for the Iraqis, or a new school, or we'd contract to supplement Iraqi intelligence with a company here. And I'd know about it way before any publicity was given to it or anybody became aware of it. Somebody figured it out, so they started classifying parts of the contracts. I wrote a book that was published in 2021 called Blown to Hell, about a test we did in 1954 that dropped radioactive fallout on an atoll on the Marshall Islands called Rongelap. I had been out there and visited it, to be honest, in the 70s, and wrote about it afterwards a little bit. I wrote the whole book off the web. The material you can find on the web, once you learn how to research, is phenomenal. I even found some private people who were involved in doing this test, took place in 1954, put their private diaries on the web, and I tracked it down. It was stunning. But you're all much better, I'm sure, at dealing with computers than I am. but I'm still amazed at what you can find out. Spend time just following every trail. And the contracts one I still use.
Thank you. We have 3 more minutes, but again, yes, please.
So, Anthony mentioned the ongoing OPCW probe, the cover-up, alleged cover-up at Duma. I really encourage everybody to listen to Aaron Mate on the floor of the UN Security Council, speaking to the UN Security Council. I thought his breakdown of this was phenomenal. But I also wanted to ask what your response. Brazil spoke up at that UN Security Council on March 24th. They spoke up because Jose Bustani, who you mentioned, the former director of the OPCW, his testimony at that Security Council was blocked. I just wanted to get your response about the statement from Brazil about Jose Bustani's testimony being blocked, and if you know why it was that testimony was blocked.
I don't think we have enough time in 2 minutes to go into the details of this. It's a very long and complex and actually ongoing quarrel between Aaron Mate and Gray Zone and a bunch of others alleging a cover-up. Yeah, if you want to contact me directly and have a chat about it, probably a good idea if we want to try to get into it here in the last minute.
Okay, any quick question that we can just cover in 2 minutes?
Sure. So I'll just ask very quickly. I'm an early career journalist and I'm kind of new to DC and hoping to cover national security. I'm wondering if either of you have any advice for kind of starting up those kind of net relationships with sources and kind of cultivating those from the get-go.
My one piece of advice on that would be don't be trying to break news on your first meeting with someone. Go in like you would with your meeting anybody. Meet him for a coffee. Meet him somewhere that's just a pleasant place you can talk informally. Developing a relationship, sources is like any other relationship and takes time to build trust with people. So I'd say, and that's hard working for a newswire. I found that it's been very difficult, but those relationships take time, so give them time.
I've said it before, and I've always lived by that. Don't go unknowing. Read as much as you can, not just about the subject, but about the person you're talking to, so that you're not there begging for information. You're having a conversation in which you have your own ideas. And you're not there just saying, what is this? What is that? What's going on? Show that you have done preparation. I mean, think of it's a college situation in which you're going for an exam and you've read everything. So you're prepared to answer questions. Preparation for any kind of meeting and any kind of interview is, to me, key to journalism. You're not begging for news. You're trying to find out what's true. And therefore, you come with a certain amount of knowledge. And what Anthony's saying, trying to meet people, the best place, if you're in a situation where they exist, go to meetings, go to conferences, listen to speakers. And then if if they're in an area you're interested in, go talk to them after their speech and pursue what they said. And then remember who they are and have a contract.
Thank
It's
you. I'm sorry, yes.
No, it is, I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm 90 years old, give me a break. And still doing it. The Post let me work there till I was 82. I had a deal with Don Graham to stay till I was 85. But Bezos cut it short. But I come to things so differently than I did when I started. But I started essentially at the bottom as a copy boy in New York Times, and then wrote for a small North Carolina paper for years, in which I had to compete with the wire. So I had to find alternative sources of information. But I say with the thing that Anthony said, to become the most knowledgeable person on the subject that you can be. And that takes time.